Thanks very much for having me here. After the young enthusiasm, you've got the old fart talking now, so sorry about that. But it is really a great thrill to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to come and take part in this process again. Okay, I just want to say at the start that this is a fascinating process. It's way ahead of anything else anywhere in the country. Your minister said they wanted to be, South Australia wanted to be leading in Australia in this. I think you're leading in the world in this. I have the good fortune to travel around the world a fair bit and interact with different groups around the place and hear different thinking about how we're dealing with things here. And I can honestly say that here in South Australia, you're certainly up there in terms of your forward thinking about this and trying to work through these difficult issues. So I guess my message is good luck with it, and please don't screw it up. Okay, so we're talking about the nature of South Australia. And I started by thinking, okay, well, what does that mean? So I did what everybody does and go on Google and look at nature of South Australia. And these are just a few of the images that come up. They're what you would expect, nice open landscapes, amazing plant communities, diverse landscapes, and a whole range of different species and so on. So that's what we think of when we talk about nature, the biodiversity, what we have to conserve and so on. But also amongst all these other things are pictures like this. And to me this encapsulates, I think, where we're getting to now, where before nature and humanity were sort of separate, and humanity was causing all the problems and nature was out there, and we just messed it up. But in fact, humans are part of nature, and our natural habitat is just as important as well. And so if we do want to engage all these people, we need to start thinking not just about the nature reserves and so on, but the whole landscape and how that fits into how we manage it, the production landscapes, the urban landscapes, and so on. Here's another picture that popped up of the nature of South Australia. So, okay, we laugh, yes, this is Paterson's curse, that's really stupid. But we need to recognise that the vast proportion of people have no idea that these aren't native Australian wildflowers. And if you tell them, yuck, those plants are horrible, they get confused and they think, oh God, what's the point? So we need to think very carefully about our messaging and how we go about dealing with these mixed landscapes that are changed now, and people like them, whether true biologists like them or not. And we've got the whole big context of climate change and everything like that. So South Australia, again, is ahead of the pack here. Our federal government is getting way behind the pack, and I don't want to talk about what's happening in the US at the moment. But we've got the climate change thing to deal with, and we have all the arguments about how to deal with it, and that's working through. I just wanted to say, though, that climate change is only one of the issues. We've got a real het up about climate change recently, and it's a big issue. But it's just one issue that overlays everything else that we have to deal with in the conservation arena. We're still dealing with loss of biodiversity through land clearing. We're dealing with changed fire regimes. We're dealing with invasive species. We've got all these things to deal with, and they're all interacting with climate change. This is a picture of what's going on in Western Australia as I speak. We were talking about stepping back from the bushfires and dealing with the big picture stuff. I'm dealing with the big picture stuff here, but I've just come from this in Western Australia. This is a road that's being pushed through prime Banksia woodlands and wetlands in Perth, and it's a completely stupid thing to do, and there's huge community reaction to it. There's lots of young people out there protesting. Our Premier calls them hippie ratbags, so what can you say about that? But this is going on as we speak. And, as somebody mentioned already, we have a lot to deal with in terms of the ongoing loss of diversity that we're constantly encountering. And Aldo Leopold called it living alone in a world of wounds. So I think, if you know what's going on, it's hard not to get emotional about it. And those of you who heard my talk before will know that I talked a lot about the grieving process and how this is relevant to what we're dealing with. Any kind of loss involves a certain amount of grief, And you go through different stages in this grieving process where you deny what's going on, you're very angry about it, you may get depressed, you start thinking about bargaining about it, well, maybe we can do this and it'll be all right. And then finally there's an acceptance that, yes, this is going on, but we can move on and do something about it. And of course, this is shown as a kind of, well, a spiraling process here. But all of these things can occur simultaneously, and certainly the people who are protesting about the bulldozers in Perth at the moment are very angry, sometimes depressed. They're certainly not accepting it at the moment. It's happening right now, so it's an ongoing matter. So the response to this is, okay, well, what do we do about it? How do we get through this? We've got to this stage, we've recognised that it's happening, we recognise that we probably need to do something different. What can that be? Well, the answer is, well, just think about it and fix it. And there's a kind of bipolar approach to this. Sometimes you think, oh yeah, we can fix it, Bob the Builder can come along and fix it. And other times you think, no, no way, no way. So sometimes, it's one or the other. And I think both are true. Sometimes you can fix it, and sometimes there's no way you can fix it. So this forum is at this present moment, and we know where we've been in the past, and there's a lot of people who think, okay, well, we just need to go back to what we were doing then, get things back, turn the clock back to where we were before, and we'll be right. But we're staring into this uncertain future, which is changing very rapidly, and we're not quite sure how the past connects to that future. So that's really what we're talking about in this forum, I think. My message is, as it says here, we have to learn from our history, but we can't live in it. The history is past. We can use it as a guide, but we can't use it as a straitjacket. We have to think about how that past relates to what's going on in the future. Just a little vignette of what I think, where we've been. For those of you who visited Western Australia, this is just on the outskirts of Fremantle. It's the Dingo Flour Mill, and this Dingo flour icon has become very famous. It's on T-shirts and bags and all sorts of stuff. Just recently, they decided that it was looking a bit shabby, so they wanted to tizzy it up. And so they set about replacing the front of that building. They took it all down, and then through a very precise process, the computer generated the new image. They made sure they had all the positioning right and so on, and lo and behold, the dingo came back again, good as new. And I suspect that we still think that we can do this with ecosystems too, that some of our ecosystems are looking a bit shabby now, and we can just sort of do some fiddling around and get them back exactly the way they were before. And that's some of the thinking behind some of the more rigid restoration talk that's going on. I don't know how many of you have seen these new standards that came out last year. The Society for Ecological Restoration Australia brought out these standards for ecological restoration. And they had a 5-point scale where you can grade what's going on, and 5 is back to the way it was, and 1 is still pretty crap. And the idea is that you have this hierarchy of things that you can do, and that the ultimate is to the full ecological restoration, which is getting the indigenous system back more or less the same way as it was, or similar to the reference ecosystem. And I think that this is great in principle. Their principle for it is the full recovery is the goal of the ecological restoration, even if the outcomes take very long time frames. And other people have said that all ecosystems should be considered candidates for restoration regardless of the requisite resources. And sure, I agree with that, but the sting is in the tail there, regardless of the requisite resources. Hands up in this room if you've got enough resources to do the things you need to do in your day jobs. No? Oh, okay. All right. So that's the kind of theoretical approach to putting, we want to put things back as best we can, the way we can. How does it work in reality? Well, I like flying, and I had the pleasure of flying in this restored Tiger Moth trainer airplane a few years ago. The reason we were able to restore this plane so that it could fly and not plummet out of the sky with me in it was because there's very detailed manuals available. They know every bit of this plane, they know how it connects to every other bit, they know how they all function, they know the systems and so on. When we get to ecosystems, we don't actually have manuals like that. We're still struggling to understand the basic ecology of even our dominant species in some ways. So we don't have these manuals that we need. Now, interestingly, this is a eucalypt forest here, but that eucalypt forest is in San Francisco. It's an entirely non-native system that the local people love because it's a big fog forest and it functions really well. And there's a big argument about at the moment between people who want to restore it back to native vegetation and people who want to keep it as it is. But the underlying thing is that species do their own thing. And we sometimes think we're in control, but especially in this changing world, we're finding more and more things surprise us. And that applies across the board. So suddenly a threatened bird species will start feeding on a non-native tree. It never did that before. So we're dealing with all these chain settings that we need to get to grips with in our conservation discussions. So right at the very start, we said that good intentions weren't good enough, and that we really need good outcomes as well. And that's really what I think my work's been about, is trying to make sure that we have all these good intentions, but that they do translate into things that actually work on the ground. So what does success look like? Well, it's a really big question, and to some extent it's at the nub of what we're talking about here. What actually we're trying to achieve? And it really depends what the goals are. And they're not going to be uniform goals, as you said, across the whole country. They're going to be different in different places, different systems, different settings, and so on. So this is the international version of the restoration guidelines, and they say that they seek the highest and best effort progression towards full recovery. And so, again, that's saying that we want to get back to some kind of reference ecosystem as best we can. And I say, yeah, let's keep that as an aspirational goal. But how often can we actually achieve that? There's two ways of looking at it when I've talked to people about this. Some people say, yeah, it's really good to have that aspirational goal in there. It's a stretch goal. It means that we try as hard as we can to do the best we can, and that's fine. As long as the stretch goals don't start stretching the people doing them to oblivion, and we end up with people managing natural areas that look like this. When I talk to conservation people, ecosystem managers, resource managers around the country and around the world, these are direct quotes from what people have said. They say, I'm overwhelmed by the scale of the tasks at hand and the unrealistic expectations of what we can achieve. And someone else said, we're shackled by vastly inadequate resources available in relation to what needs to be done. So the aspirations are there, but the ability to actually achieve those aspirations are often markedly less than they should be. It depends on your situation, of course. If you're working with a mining company doing rehab, you have lots of money, lots of big machines, lots of opportunity to do things that cost a huge amount of money. If you're a community group like this one out in the wheat belt here, you have a very enthusiastic community wanting to do lots of stuff, often very little financial support to do it, but a lot of enthusiasm. And so therefore the opportunities are different, and so a lot of the problems are different as well. So this is my metaphor for your average conservation manager. Here he is here, and this is the scale of the challenges for conservation and restoration that they're facing. And this is often the response. So to me, the metaphor for this is like being stuck in a riptide. I'm sure you have rips off Adelaide here, do you? Yeah. So everybody knows what you're supposed to do in a riptide. The immediate gut reaction when you're stuck in a rip is to swim like crazy towards the shore. And that's entirely the wrong thing to do, because if you do that, the rip's going to win, you're going to tire, you're going to get swept out to the ocean. You have to do the totally counterintuitive thing, which is to swim off to the side and then come back in that way. So to me, that's where we are in this whole conservation, restoration discussion at the moment. We're stuck in a riptide, trying it the best we can to get to where we want to go, and slowly getting pushed further and further away from it. So I think we need to try and find sideways out of that and find better ways of doing things. Of course, we can always do with more money. And the response that I get when I say this to people is, yes, if we just had more money and resources, we'd be fine. We'll never have enough money and resources to do everything that we need to do. It'd be nice to have a lot more, and we can try for that. But in the meantime, we still have to think very carefully about what we're doing and how we're doing it. So how do we get out of the rip? I don't have any concrete answers, but these are just a few things that pop up as potential ways to think about it. First of all, we have to start with what's there. Start with the ecosystem we have, not what we think should be there. That's a trap that gets you into endless do loops of lots of action. Look at what nature's doing already. We always hear about working with nature instead of against it, but often a lot of the things we're doing are working totally against the nature that's there at the moment. We have to decide on what the goal is and think about SMART goals. SMART means they have to be specific, they have to be measurable, they have to be achievable. A also stands for they have to be agreed as well, so getting buy-in is really important. They have to be realistic and they have to be time-based. We have to work out alternative ways of achieving that goal. We often have a fairly set view of how we're going to get there, but there may be other ways of thinking about it. And think through a strategy and the timing of intervention so that the effort's not wasted. We do a heck of a lot of work which actually never achieves anything, either because it's not followed up or it's not done at the right time or whatever. One that I repeatedly see is where people are removing invasive species, especially weed species, and not thinking about what happens next. If you're going to be removing weeds, you need to be putting back something that you actually want. Otherwise, you're just going to repeat the problem. And we need to think about doing different things in different parts of the landscapes. So I can't go through the talk without talking about novel ecosystems, since people have mentioned it already. The idea that some of our systems have changed so much that there's no point in even thinking about trying to restore them back to something natural. And perhaps we don't even want to because they've got values in their own right. Many of our landscapes look like this now. They're patchwork landscapes with production, urban areas, semi-natural areas, areas that are still in really good condition from a biodiversity perspective. And each of these have different values or ecosystem services, and each of them have different ways of managing them. And a lot of the time, what we're trying to do when we're managing ecosystems is push things away from where they are now to where we think they ought to be. And in many cases, where they are now is actually a lot more valuable than we give them credit for. So what we've been thinking about in our work is looking at this kind of portfolio of arrangements that we can have. This graph just shows you a map of different ecosystems, if you like, changes in biotic or abiotic composition along the x-axis and changes in function on the y-axis. The ones down in the bottom left are still in very good condition. They're still functioning normally. They've still got the historic biodiversity and so on. As you move further away from that, composition changes, function changes, and what we need to do or what we can do in them also changes. And for each of these situations, there's an array of different interventions we could contemplate, some of which are going to cost a fortune and may or may not work, and others which may be much less costly but achieve a similar or a slightly different goal. And we're not very good at thinking those different alternatives through. And that's where I suggest that there's a lot of opportunity to actually think more creatively about what we're doing in the landscape. So this is common in business management. It's called strategic portfolio management. And you have a strategy, an operating plan, and you execute it. And it's all devised through, first of all, establishing where you want to go, then creating options, priorities, and going through them. So the portfolio approach has a range of different sites. and for each site, its current condition and desired and agreed trajectory is discussed. And there's a wide range of potential interventions from do nothing through to full-on restoration. There's a bit of a thought about costs and benefits in each case. And if you look at them as a portfolio of sites, you can actually get benefits by thinking about more broadly about what you're doing where and how it fits into the overall benefit. And the key thing is that there's no need to have the same goals or to intervene in the same way across all the sites. You don't need to think that you're going to have a strategy that applies in every place. Just an example of this, I was in Canberra a couple of months ago and had the opportunity to visit Mulligan's Flat Woodland Sanctuary. I don't know how many of you know of this place, but it's a lovely place just on the outskirts of Canberra. And they've decided to go hell for leather and try and restore a functioning fauna there, try and replace a lot of the mammals that were had gone extinct in this area. They're restoring the vegetation inside it. They put this huge predator-proof fence around it, and they're going great guns. They just had what do you call them? The native cats in there. Quolls, that's the one. We call them Chudich in Western Australia. That's why I get confused. And it's great. They're doing a great job. It cost a fortune. They had their First Minister involved in it. He provided a lot of government money. They got a lot of sponsorship. And then the amazing thing about it is it's right next to suburbia. And the local people are very supportive. They have free access. There's been very few problems with gates being left open or anything like that. The same group that manage this, though, also manage Jerrabomba wetlands in Canberra. They're at the headwaters of Lake Burley-Griffin, and this is an entirely different kettle of fish. They're very valuable wetlands. There's platypus, there's lots of different birds and so on, but they only formed when Lake Burley-Griffin filled, so they're on top of old grasslands, old dairy fields and things like that. And the people that run Jerrabomba recognise that they're not going to be able to change that, and so they've actually recognise that this is what they call a novel ecosystem that has very important values that they're not going to change in a hurry, and so their focus is on managing what's there in a way that's going to enhance the values that it has. The platypus doesn't care that it's not a natural wetland. It's perfectly happy there. So one of the things to think about, and I get myself into a lot of trouble talking about this, is that the old paradigm is that native things are always good and non-native things are always bad. Unfortunately, I think that's way too simplistic in today's world. Some native, well, most natives are still good, obviously, although some are causing problems because of changing ranges. But not all non-natives are bad. In fact, some of our threatened species depend on non-native species now. And just an example from here in Western Australia, I was at a conference in New England, University of New England last week, and Dave Payton talked about the Monarta Woodlands Conservation Park. An amazing area that was about 2,000 hectares planted out in the 1970s. About 250 species were planted, and they came from all over. Some of them were local natives, and some were from a long way away, Western Australia, everywhere else. After about 40 years, when David went back and looked at these, some of the non-natives were actually faring a lot better than the native species. They were surviving, they were thriving, and so on. And more importantly, they were providing important habitat and resources for many of the key bird species that are important in this area. So in this case, having a broader perspective of what constitutes nature in this case is probably a good thing to think about. Another example that comes from another talk at this conference, and this was from David Norton, New Zealand, and everybody can see what this was here. This is gorse from my native Scotland. Yay. And everybody agrees that gorse is a big problem, right? And in New Zealand, they spent, I don't know how much, millions of dollars trying to control it, remove it, get rid of it. When someone had the bright idea that, hey, what happens if we just leave the gorse and see what happens? And it turns out that if you just leave the gorse where it is, the natives actually start growing through it. They're an ideal nurse plant for establishing native plants. So to me, this is a prime example of looking for the way out the rip. Instead of spending your life trying to control this goddamn plant, leave it there, and eventually the natives will overtop it, and you save yourself all that time and effort. So instead of being like Sisyphus, who always rolled his rock up to the top of the hill and then it fell back down again, I think, if we're looking at things like removing all invasive species, which is often a goal for conservation managers, I think sometimes we can alleviate that load a little bit by thinking laterally about it. That doesn't mean to say that we give up. When I talk about this, people say, oh God, he's talking about invasive species. No, there's nasty things out there that we need to be worried about, but there's a lot of things that we could think laterally about in different ways. So just wrapping up, what does all this mean? Well, I think one of the things to think about is that we don't need to do the same thing everywhere. In fact, putting all our eggs in one basket is a really bad thing to do. In this changing climate, in all the changes that are going on, we don't actually know what the answer is going to be. And so we want to try a range of different things in different places and see what's working and learn from it. There's a whole range of things happening around the world looking at ways to do this sensibly. This was from a group in Georgia. Southeastern the US is going through exactly the same kinds of issues that we're talking about here. They came up with this idea of working towards achievable future conditions. And I won't go through the details of this, but basically it's a process of looking at where we are now, looking at future scenarios which may include climate change and may not, looking at a risk assessment for biodiversity and so on, and then coming up with a range of possible options for dealing with that. And of course it's an iterative process so that you're always checking and seeing whether things are working or not. Now this is just one of many different possibilities, and they're trying this out right now. So the bottom line to me is that I think we have to come to terms with the fact that we're living in rapid environmental change and rapid socioeconomic change as well. This doesn't mean that we give up on standardized approaches. That's not what I'm saying at all. There's still a place for all the standard conservation and restoration approaches, but we can augment them and we can adapt them. It also doesn't mean accepting defeat or losing hope, but it may mean reassessing some of our goals and expectations. And as this article in NC a little while ago said, changing times call for changes in how we protect and restore habitat. So thinking broadly, coming up with different approaches and trying them out. And in the end, I think we have to be optimistic. Otherwise, we can all just go and get drunk, I suppose. That would be good. Might do that anyway. But I think optimism is looking to the future and seeing what's possible, and I think that's where we need to go in this forum. Thank you very much.